COVID-19 measures.
For Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member for Vimy, who will be giving her maiden speech in this venerable House. Mr. Speaker, it is an honour for me to be in the House today and to speak on behalf of the residents of Davenport. It's also an honour for me to join my colleagues today to participate in this important debate on Bill C-20. And Bill C-20 includes three key parts. The first part is basically to make a number of adjustments that's going to expand the eligibility criteria around the Canada emergency wage. Part two basically is a number of changes that needs to occur in order for us to be able to provide a one-time payment to persons with disabilities for reasons related to COVID-19. And part three is basically a number of appropriate changes to certain acts that will provide some flexibility to certain time limits that were difficult or impossible to meet as a result of the exceptional circumstances produced by COVID-19. And I will be talking to part two, Mr. Speaker. This bill would allow information sharing between several federal departments and agencies and the Employment and Social Development Canada so that a one-time payment can be made to support persons with disabilities during this pandemic. So we have to allow for this information sharing to be shared between several departments in order for us to be able to deliver this one-time payment as soon as we possibly can. This one-time $600 payment will help approximately 1.7 million Canadians with disabilities who are recipients of the Disability Tax Credit Certificate, receiving CPP disability, or receiving QPP disability benefits, and/or disability supports provided by Veterans Affairs Canada. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-20 is just one part of the much larger plan that our government has dedicated to supporting Canadians with disabilities. Today, I want to talk about the evolution of our plan, the actions we've undertaken, and our government's next steps towards creating an inclusive and barrier-free Canada. In 2015, our government named the first ever cabinet minister responsible for persons with disabilities and promised Canadians that we would pass legislation aimed at removing barriers to inclusion. This signaled our commitment to do things differently in order to ensure that all Canadians have an equal chance at success. One of the key milestones of this journey was the National Disability Summit that we held in October in May 2019, in the days prior to COVID. The summit provided an opportunity for participants to exchange best practices and to create and build on partnerships. The summit allowed us to understand the next steps needed to truly realize an inclusive and accessible Canada. At the same time that the summit was taking place, our federal government's landmark legislation, the Accessible Canada Act, was being finalized following the most comprehensive consultations with the disability community in our country's history. More than 6,000 Canadians and 100 disability organizations shared their views and ideas about an accessible Canada. And as we know, the Act received royal assent on June 21st, 2019, and came into force in July of that same year. The legislation builds upon existing mechanisms and ensures compliance and accountability. The Accessibility Canada Act takes a proactive and systemic approach to identifying, removing, and preventing barriers to accessibility in key areas within federal jurisdiction. The goal of the Act was to ensure that it was based on safeguarding human rights and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Act also created new entities, such as the Accessibility Standards Canada, which creates and reviews accessibility standards for federally regulated organizations. I'm proud of this legislation because it sends a clear message to Canadians that persons with disabilities will no longer be treated as an afterthought. From the start, systems will now be designed to be inclusive for all Canadians. This is because it is our systems, our policies, our practices, and our laws that need to be fixed and not our people. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, I also want to point out that in the mandate letter of the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, there's also a number of very important additional measures that will continue to ensure that we promote disability inclusion, including undertaking initiatives to improve the economic inclusion of persons with disabilities, and specifically target barriers to full participation in the labor force, including addressing discrimination and stigma, raising public awareness, and working with employers and businesses in a coordinated way. This and a number of other measures, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion has said, we move from nothing about us, without us, to nothing without us, because everything in society touches the lives of Canadians with disabilities. The Government of Canada is leading the way in ensuring communities and workplaces are accessible and inclusive for persons with disabilities. It is the largest federal employer. It is also the single largest purchaser of goods and services in this country, and it provides vital programs and services to Canadians. As such, we have committed to hiring at least 5,000 persons with disabilities over the next 5 years in the federal public service. We are also committed to applying an accessibility lens on government procurement and project planning. Over the last 5 years, our government has worked tirelessly to improve the lives of Canadians with disabilities. I wish to share some of the highlights over our 2 mandates, which began in 2015. Our government applied a disability lens to our flagship policies and programs, such as the Canada Child Benefit, the National Housing Strategy, and the Infrastructure Program. The result? Families with children with disabilities receive an additional amount under the CCB. For example, from 2017 to 2018, 1.75 million children benefited from the disability supplement. Under the National Housing Strategy, there is a commitment to promote universal design and visitability. This includes the following requirements: that public and shared spaces meet accessibility standards, and that at least 2,400 new affordable housing units for persons with developmental disabilities are created. In the area of infrastructure, we have approved nearly 800 accessibility projects, including almost 500 new paratransit buses and improvements to 81 existing transit facilities to make them more accessible to Canadians. This was made possible by ensuring that accessibility was an eligible expense in public transit projects. In just 1 year, almost $800 million was invested into our public transit systems to make them more accessible. We have also increased our investments in existing programs such as the Enabling Accessibility Fund, the Social Development Partnerships Program, and the Opportunities Fund. All 3 of these programs were significantly enhanced, allowing people to keep doing the good job that they are doing to improve the lives of Canadians with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, current COVID-19 supports have been amply covered by my colleagues for the last 24 hours, but I want to bring them to mind briefly. Since the pandemic was declared, our government has taken a disability-inclusive response to the pandemic. This included adhering to the principle of nothing without us from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to the creation of the COVID-19 Disability Advisory Group to bring the lived experience of persons with disabilities to our government's response to the pandemic. We provided additional support to students with permanent disabilities and the one-time payment that is part of the debate today. We invested in mental health through the Wellness Together portal. We launched calls for proposals under 2 components of the Enabling Accessibility Fund and created a national workplace accessibility stream of the Opportunities Fund to help fund people with disabilities find jobs right now. And finally, we added funding to the Social Development Partnerships Program to enhance accessibility communications during this crisis and invested $1.18 million in 5 new projects across the country through the Accessible Technology Program to help develop dynamic and affordable technology. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, from the Canadian Survey on Disability, we know that Canadians with disabilities are underemployed compared to the general population, a situation made worse by this pandemic. As the economy opens up again, this represents opportunity for a vast and largely untapped pool of talent, people who are available to work and want to join the workforce, and who are ready to apply their innovative ideas to our new normal. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, I would call upon my colleagues to quickly pass this legislation before us so that we can get support out to the people who urgently and immediately need it. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm now ready.